Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for joining us on the second episode of the Hunt Institute's new series, Conversations with State Chiefs. We are thrilled today to be joined by Superintendent Jillian Baylor of Wyoming, Superintendent Kirsten Baszler of North Dakota, Superintendent Sherry Ibarra of Idaho, and Dr. Carissa Moffat-Miller, the Executive Director of the Council of Chief State School Officers. Before we get started, I would quickly like to point your attention to our social media hashtag. If you are interested in following along with our conversation, please feel free to tweet at us at Hunt_Institute or use the hashtag StateChiefsConvo. And so with that, our first episode of Conversations of State Chiefs, that was on April 29th, and that was featuring chiefs from North Carolina, Virginia, and South Carolina, as well as Dan Weisberg, the CEO of TNTP. If you missed that conversation, you can find a recap and recording on the Hunt Institute website within the day. After our welcome remarks, we'll hear from our distinguished panelists for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to pivot to a Q&A with the audience. And so if you have any questions throughout, please feel free to chat them into the Q&A feature, which you can find at the bottom of the screen. If you please be sure to include your name, title, and organization so that we can follow up if we need to with any further information. I'd now like to turn it over to the Hunt Institute's President and CEO, Dr. Javed Siddiqui, who's just going to offer some brief welcome remarks.
Thanks, Julia, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. And thank you to our panelists for taking time to share your insights. I know how busy you are during this time and appreciate you taking the opportunity to interface with all of us. It did dawn on me in the waiting room or in the lobby. We probably should have referred to this panel as Powerful Women in Education. It was not with any intent, but we have a great lineup of really important, really accomplished, highly regarded women and education leaders. And so thank you to all of you for taking time to be with us. As many of you know, this week is Teacher Appreciation Week, and this year our teachers and educators and school staff have truly stepped up to continue serving our students in ways we could have never imagined just a few months ago. So thank you for all of our teachers that are with us on behalf of all of our students for taking time out of your busy schedules, planning online learning, distance learning. I've seen chemistry teachers doing videos of labs. So it's not lost on us how much you all really mean to us every day, but especially this week. So thank you. Welcome again to Chapter 2 of the Conversations with State Chiefs. This is again a series. More information on additional webinars or Zoom meetings will be coming at the end of this conversation today. Each episode will focus on a different pressing topic that has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic to allow all of us who are passionate about education and equity for all students to work towards collaborative and meaningful solutions. And finally, we at the Institute, we do care very much about this issue of making sure educators and policymakers have the very best information available to make equitable and meaningful decisions for students. If there's anything we at the Hunt Institute can do to support you, please don't hesitate to reach out to our team. Again, thanks for all that you do. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Julia to get us going. Julia.
Thanks so much, Javed. And so first, we're going to start off. We're really excited to hear from the Executive Director of the Council for Chief State School Officers, Dr. Carissa Miller. And Dr. Miller, can you give us a brief overview of the challenges that schools and states more are facing regarding access to technology, particularly for rural students, and the logistics of some of this distance learning during these long-term school closures? You know, how does funding and economies of scale play into this?
Thanks, Julia. I appreciate that. I also want to thank the Hunt Institute team and Javed for asking me to be a part of this. I will admit I jumped at it as a product of rural schools myself in Western Nebraska. It's a little bit near and dear to my heart. I happen to have lived it, know it, and I experience it even in spite of living on the East Coast in a very large city today. So I really appreciate the opportunity. Also want to give a shout out to our teachers for teacher appreciation. To your question, Julia, about kind of the overall landscape, and I'll just say this is my rule when I'm with state chiefs who I serve. I never give any information about their state. That's their job. And so I will be using other state examples and allow them the opportunity to talk about their own states as we go forward. So it's not me omitting them, it's giving them the opportunity. You know, I was thinking about at week 4 when we were into this, how rapid the pace was that everything moved. So, you know, on a dime, people had to make decisions to shut down, to redeploy schools to online learning. And so we had to do that in a way that was quick and rapid and didn't have a lot of time for planning or deployment. But yet we see a huge amount of innovation happening. If we think about the way in which meals were delivered to kids, the variety of ways in which states put meals together and got them out to kids, use bus routes, pickup sites, and a variety of ways in which that changed over time to make sure that kids got fed. Because schools serve such an important purpose there, it's really an impressive thing. The continuous learning guidance that was put out by all 3 of the states on this call, but also the variety of ways in which we tried to continue learning, particularly for places that don't have internet connectivity. I know that these ladies are going to talk about the ways in which they've tried to address that, but there are still places that struggle mightily with getting internet connection. I have a high school friend who now teaches in another state who posted, I can't get internet access. So even if her children had access, she couldn't teach them because she didn't have it. Or she didn't have broadband that was enough for her to but we are seeing, you know, other ways in which that we're delivering this. Louisiana, I just want to give a shout out to them. Lyft donated 5,000 free rides to and from food distribution sites in the Orleans Parish to get things for students and to pick up packets and to get materials to them. You know, we're focused on Wyoming, North Dakota, and Idaho today, but let me just bring a couple of states that have even some unique challenges. We look at Alaska and Maine, for example. Alaska has an off-the-road system, right? The only way to get to some of these villages is through planes. And so there's unique challenges that come with that as well. And while their schools maybe, you know, have great broadband, some of those communities actually don't. And Maine has island systems. So you have islands, Hawaii has an island. So there's just all kinds of different challenges when we think about the term rural and remote and the way in which we get education to kids in those areas. So I'll stop there because I know we're going to have a longer discussion, but those are just some of the challenges that we're seeing.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that's a really important context to set there. And next we have Superintendent Jillian Baylor, Superintendent of Public Instruction in Wyoming. And Superintendent, can you talk a bit about what Wyoming is doing now and plans to do long-term to support rural students, particularly as it relates to some of these issues of equity that we know exist but have been exacerbated in this situation?
Yeah, thanks so much, Julia. Thanks, Javaid, for also just leading the Hunt Institute and inviting many chiefs to be on these important calls. And hopefully they serve not just the education constituency, but a greater constituency as well, as we all strive to be good leaders in our states. Also a shout out to the teachers. Thank you for all you do, and that's all I'll say about that, because yesterday when I tried to talk about it, my eyes itched really bad and got very watery. Also, just a quick acknowledgement to Carissa. Her leadership at CCSSO has just been in the forefront, and it's an honor to serve as the president of the board this year. And ironically, we're focused on partnerships and what happens outside of the school building and making it more meaningful. And we were thrust into that. I'm not taking responsibility for this, but we were thrust into kind of recreating the platform as we go. And also to Kirsten and Sherry, thanks for all the work that you do. And thank you for the support that we all have come to rely on with each other. So just to set the stage, in Wyoming, we have about 93,000 K through 12 public school students spread across 90,000 plus square miles. I live in the capital, where a few of our schools definitely fit more urban demographics than suburban or rural, but the majority of our schools and districts are considered on a national scale to be rural. For us, they're medium-sized, but they're rural in the context of the nation. So a couple of things that I just want to say, and I think our focus is leaning toward funding, but really about this whole concept of support and extra challenges in rural districts and rural states. But I want to say that when we first found out that we were that there was a possibility we would be getting money through the CARES Act, my first thought, I think it was denial in hindsight, but it was like, well, we don't need any money for this. This is a one-time deal. We're going to recover like we do snow days, and we'll go back to normal. I think every single day as we got into the pandemic, we realized two things. Number one, that there was no going back to normal. And number two, there were some lessons learned and some practices being implemented, maybe to the extreme, but that cause us as education leaders and as educators to not want to step back into the way things were. We've been working for a really long time on school reform in areas like competency-based learning and blended learning and family engagement. And all of a sudden, we were put in positions where we did that overnight, and where we engaged communities, where we engaged students, where we pivoted to a new style of learning literally overnight. So, you know, in this pandemic, I also want to mention healthcare as a pretty major roadblock for our rural communities in two ways. First of all, our rural communities that have been hit by COVID-19 have been devastated by COVID-19, economically, culturally, and in every way. And please remember, these are the same small communities that get dinged for not having prenatal care, because there are no care providers right there. They're driving 40 and 50 miles to get prenatal care, and the same is true if they take if they contract COVID-19, sometimes they don't have a hospital bed or a clinic to go to during this time. They may not even have a traveling nurse practitioner or doctor to come to them. And so there are a lot of factors to consider with respect to shelter in place and what that means in a rural community and how that affects education. The second thing with respect to healthcare is the economic impact that school closures have on the healthcare industry, have on business and industry, and in ways that maybe they're a little more distilled or diluted in suburban or urban America. So that said, as we, you know, I think as we think about taking CARES Act money, I want to really think about two things. Number one is to ensure that we're asking states that we're asking our school districts to prioritize connectivity and broadband in a way that creates a system across the state so that our students who might be mobile have access no matter where they go. And number two, to create an infrastructure in their education system that allows them to pivot to an online or blended learning environment. And both of those take money. So in hindsight, I'm really, you know, again, it was denial. We don't need money. We don't need CARES Act money, to this reality that, wow, we have an opportunity to really transform our education system for the betterment of students and for the betterment of rural communities. So I will stop there because I know my colleagues have great information to share as well.
Thank you so much, and thank you for pointing out the healthcare aspect. That's such a important part of it. And really quickly, before we switch over to Superintendent Baylor, I just wanted to remind attendees, if you have any questions, please feel free to submit them into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. We will have plenty of time to answer them afterwards. And I know I'm already coming up with lots of questions based on what we're hearing, so I'm sure you are too. And so Superintendent Baylor, moving on, can you talk a little bit about in North Dakota, what North Dakota is doing now and in the summer and fall to think about your rural students and educating them equally?
Sure will. And so, yes, just like all good Midwesterners do, we start with gratitude, and we've all done that. And I too need to start with gratitude, and just to thank the Hunt Institute for collectively convening us. To all the listeners that have chosen to use part of their day to join us in this conversation, I appreciate that. There's just a remarkable amount of information that I've learned myself being involved with the Hunt Institute, and I feel I'm grateful to them, and a long-standing relationship. For those of you that are on the call, I'm sure you've had that longer than I've had, and I appreciate you being able to listen. So thank you to the Hunt Institute. I also too want to thank Carissa and CCSSO. I can't underscore enough or amplify enough how incredibly important the CCSSO organization has been to all of us as state chiefs. I think we could all go on and on with our examples, but Carissa spoke a bit earlier about needing to pivot on a dime. And you had in North Dakota, we had about 2, maybe 3 days to come up for breath after we went fully on distance learning. And then we needed to transition into what does recovery look like, and what will that mean? And so we had some time, and every time we picked up the phone or anytime I needed information, I received it not by the end of the day, but within the next few hours. And so that's been incredibly important. I had the opportunity this morning to teach a group of 7th graders. And one of our local social studies teachers asked if I wouldn't mind coming in, and they were talking about leadership, and they were just discussing within their social studies class leadership, and asked if I would jump on and do that call. So I taught a class this morning of 12 and 13-year-olds, and it was just such a good reminder of what this work is all about and what distance teaching and learning actually felt like. And as they discussed leadership, I thought so much about, Sherry and Jillian and Carissa and all of us that are on the line listening today. It's everything that our young people are describing as leadership is what we're doing, and they need that right now. And they are able to articulate what leadership looks like and sounds like even more eloquently, I believe, because of what they've seen in the last several weeks of not only just leaders that they watch at press conferences every afternoon, but also the leaders within their communities, the leaders within their buildings and within their classrooms. And so with that, I would just like to say, Teacher Week, this is amazing. And I will share a quote of Lee Iacocca, the great auto industry, for those of us that are old enough to remember how influential and powerful Lee Iacocca was. His quote was, in a completely rational world, all of us would be teachers, and the rest of us would be left to settle for something else. And so that truly does, I think, really on a Teacher Appreciation Day and week, isn't that the truth? And so in this time of COVID, what a great opportunity for us to lift up education again. That is, too often described in this nation as mediocre or bureaucratic and at best, minimalistic. And so this is a time, by our sheer absence, we have really been able to just really celebrate what education is. And so I think it's important that we do that. And so now to talk a little bit about what we've been doing in North Dakota. Obviously, broadband is a major issue. The gap, the inequity gap. Equity is it's the course of who we are. Sherry, Gillian, and I talk about this all the time. Not only are we rural, but Carissa mentioned some other issues. Other states, Hawaii and Alaska and Maine are 3 very good examples. Sherry, Jillian, and I talk often on the phone because we have actually, I think, another bond in addition to being rural and sometimes isolated and remote, but we're Midwest. And so we're often described as those flyover states. And so there are often times that we are not only rural and remote and isolated, we're also flyovers. So how do we have our voices heard, have our students' voices heard in times like this, and what's the uniqueness of that? And I would argue we call ourselves West or Midwest, and Ohio calls themselves Midwest, and I'm really gonna die on my sword because Ohio is not Midwest. For all of you from Ohio, I hope I didn't offend you, but it's real, that's a real thing. So, but there is that uniqueness, and so I think it's important that we bring that about too. One of my favorite lines I borrow from Jillian: rural doesn't mean poor, and rural doesn't mean left behind. And I think too often we get painted with that brush. We have very successful people with telecommunicating opportunities that the rest of the nation is just embracing more fully. North Dakota has been doing that for quite a long time, which has provided, people are choosing to come back to North Dakota. We have the second largest Microsoft campus in the world, and located in Fargo, North Dakota. And so we've been telecommuting, which provided some opportunities for us to not have that digital divide, less than 1% of our students live in a house that don't have access to broadband. And so we immediately worked with our telecommunications associations to determine that. And of that less than 1%, what did we do to figure it out? And so we figured it out with hotspots and, you know, some other creative solutions. And we will, as we look at coming back, and that's where CCSSO was just tremendously helpful. We actually considered some of our counties. I think we have 18 or 20 counties of our 53 that have no cases yet of a confirmed COVID-19 case. And so we were considering it. In the end, the governor and I decided that we would continue distance learning through the rest of this school calendar year. But we had a re-entry plan, a North Dakota Smart Restart for K-12 stood up in 5 days, absolutely, with all players, our task force, but that wouldn't have happened without CCSSO and my colleagues that are on the line, as I called them and said, hey, what are you doing? And so we are ready to go, but when they do come back, the important issues of equity is reigning supreme on the minds of the governor and I. We need to have those diagnostic assessments to make sure that we're meeting each student where they're at. We do have the saying of no child is ahead, no child is behind. They're exactly where they need to be, but it's our job as a system to figure out where that is. And so we need to figure that out with diagnostic assessments. And so we're figuring that out on a statewide contract. We're also figuring out potential statewide contract for all of our learners. So not just public school, we have 95% of our students are in our public school system, about 5% are in our non-public private school systems, but buying licenses for all of our learners to start engaging right away on a personalized precision type of learning path. So I would just end with something that Jillian had said as well. The idea of reinventing ourselves and innovation. The governor and I are on the same page when it comes to this. Right now, there are 3 jobs that we're focusing on: responding to what is the here and now, moving us through recovery, but most importantly, making sure that we're never the same system that we were in February of 2020. Those that choose to go back to the way that it was will be on that same trajectory. And it's our opinion in North Dakota that that trajectory isn't good enough for all of our kids, all of them, not just some. And so we will be using this as a transformation opportunity to reinvent ourselves and make sure that all students are receiving the education that they need for them to be successful. So with that, thanks.
Thank you so much, Superintendent Baylor. And then finally, for our last introductory remarks, we are so excited to have with us Superintendent Sherry Ibarra, the Superintendent of Public Instruction in Idaho. And so, Superintendent, can you also share some of what Idaho is thinking about, both for now and for the future, in terms of, mitigating student learning loss for these rural students and, really taking this opportunity to best support them moving forward?
Thank you, Julia. I really appreciate the invite today. Follow suit with my colleagues here and say thank you to the Hunt Institute, as well as Kirsten and Jillian and Carissa. Couldn't do this without your partnership, and you're going to hear me talk a little bit about that importance here in a moment. But I also want to say, as a former educator, a former 3rd grade teacher and a building principal, happy Educator Week. I just admire the passion and the resilience during this tough time out of our educators. I've seen some great work. And so I want to say happy Educator Week to everyone out there listening. To give a little context around Idaho and how rural we really are, I just want to state a couple of facts here. We're the nation's 11th largest state, but about 40th in population. We stretch from the Canadian border to Nevada in the south, and it's 652 miles from our northernmost town to our southernmost town, which is a 10.5-hour drive and a time change as well. We average 16 persons per square mile compared to the 83 persons for the United States on average, and 88% of Idaho's land area is in counties classified as rural. So that's just to give you kind of a picture of our geographic diversity and our size, which helps illustrate the challenges that we face in meeting Idaho's constitutional mandate to provide a uniform, thorough, and free system of public education. And of course, as we all stated, that pandemic has made those challenges even greater. But I also want to say that this adversity has created an opportunity, like Kirsten said, for us to be more engaging and to catapult us into an opportunity to try out new ways of delivering learning to our students. At the state level, I just want to highlight a few things we're doing to support our kids in the rural areas. And again, like I said earlier, I can't emphasize enough how important partnerships have been to all pull the rope in the same direction to make sure that life really does go on for kids. And one of the partners that we work with is Idaho Digital Learning Alliance, which is actually a state entity. It was created by our Idaho legislature and funded by the state through student fees. And so it's been a collaboration with our school districts and our teachers. We're providing online courses, virtual services, and e-learning expertise. They have programs and courses for our secondary students in all our required content areas. And they offer some dual credit online too. So I do want to say that while they provide curriculum and content to districts and charters, we do still struggle a little bit because they're really focused on basically our 7 through 12. So we are looking at ways that we can support our younger group of students. So another partnership that's really been helpful in that area is with Idaho Public Television in Idaho. And so we worked with them to create something called Classroom Idaho, Learn at Home, to provide lessons for those grades that we're a little more challenged with, which is 3 through 6 grades. And their theory was maybe not everybody has a device, maybe not everybody has connectivity, but just about everybody has a TV. So they had lessons on their home channels. We helped them to recruit and retain some of our teachers to provide those lessons. So those are some really great opportunities to partner and reach some of our most rural and remote areas in Idaho. Again, we also partnered with Idaho Business for Education. They are doing a lot to make sure that we are trying to provide connectivity and devices to students, but that's a real challenge. That's one of our biggest challenges because, we did do a survey and we're looking at about 30% still of our Idaho students that have gaps in either internet or devices. And I've talked to Kirsten and Jillian about this very topic, and as well as CCSSO has been very supportive in that arena too. I think the CARES funding is really going to be critical in Idaho to moving forward and providing that equity. And so one of the things that we are really looking at in Idaho is providing a learning management system, that online platform. Some districts in Idaho do have that opportunity, but there are some districts in Idaho that do not have a learning management platform to track outcomes for all of our students. So we need to partner with folks and make sure, again, that our students have connectivity and devices. That'll be a challenge for us as we look at strategic ways to make sure that everybody has a learning management system. I know I'm not alone in these challenges. Again, I want to thank everybody for the conversations that we have, the late night phone calls with my fellow chiefs, and the last minute texts that they are great at returning, and Carissa as well, as we work through these challenges. Again, I can't say enough about how partnerships are going to be, I think, so important as we face these challenges. And we all know that there's discussion around maybe a part 2 to this in the fall. And so we really feel like in Idaho, this is a great opportunity to catapult us into a new way of thinking about education. Like you said, Kirsten, it often sometimes gets a bad reputation for being bureaucratic and stuck in the same way, but I don't think it's the folks in the system's fault. It's hard to change a big system, but we have an opportunity now. We've kind of been catapulted into it, and so we have an opportunity to change the way we do business. So I'm very excited about working on these challenges with everybody moving forward.
Thank you so much. And we're going to now switch over to the Q&A. We've had some really great questions chatted into the Q&A. If you have any, please feel free to send them in now. We're kind of sorting through them to make sure we can get to as many as possible. So please feel free to get those in, and we will try to make time for all of them. But I'll start first with Dr. Miller. Can you discuss some strategies that states are using for really those most vulnerable rural student populations, students with disabilities or food insecurity or no or little access to technology? What can states do to really support those students?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I want to lay a frame first for what smaller rural areas have an advantage, and that is oftentimes you can get your arms wrapped around a problem in a much easier way than you can in a huge area, right? Like that may be excluding some of what you would consider your urban areas in these states that we're talking about, but there are ways that you can move things way faster because it's a small number to get moving. And so I think all of the chiefs have talked about what can we do to be innovative, and there is such an opportunity to scale things up in a way that it can be much harder in much larger areas. So I would amplify that. Sometimes it feels a little scary to do that, but it's much easier in rural areas. I will say one of the downsides when you're talking about technology or devices or the ways in which we serve these students that you talked about is that the economies of scale can sometimes be lost. And so you see often cooperatives by groups of districts because they have to have a way to provide services. So my colleague Sherry, I was in Idaho, but there's a group of districts that share special education services so that they can provide the services that one district alone would not be able to do because of the sheer number of folks. And that's, I'm sure, the case in many other states as well. But there's an opportunity to do economies of scale if the state steps in with some opportunities for contracts. And I'm guessing Kirsten may talk about the broadband work that they've done more often, but it's a real opportunity to scale that up and then also have enough manageable populations. I'll just mention a couple of things on the students with disabilities or students serving students with disabilities. It really became an issue early on where there was fear about serving students if you couldn't serve them all in the same way. And the reality is that's just, it's not possible. And so we have to do the best we can, and we have to not stop serving kids in a lot of ways. Again, back to rural areas, I'll just rely on my own experience. I knew every one of my teachers' names. I knew where they lived, maybe much to their chagrin. And there's just that personal connection that I think can be relied upon in a way that you may not have in larger systems. And so the delivery of services, I'll look to our colleague, Matt in Nebraska, who has talked a lot about the way in which you just connect with students and provide the services that you can and try to adjust students' IEPs or timelines or whatever it is that they need. And so that's one of the ways it's being done. There's also mailing of packets and the public television things that Sherry mentioned. And then also Baylor University has a program where they're mailing shelf-stable food to communities that can't get access to the meal services. So there are a number of innovative ways coming online. There's also a program that's being stacked up now to mail out packets of high quality instructional materials over the summer. That's coming, and this would be something I think that would be really useful for rural areas.
Thank you. And then Superintendent Baylor, many rural students, as I'm sure you know, are highly mobile and may not enroll in the same school district year after year. What can be done to best support these students when they attend new districts in the fall?
Yeah, I'm going to steal from Dr. Miller, and she's fond of talking about local control in every state, claiming that they have local control. No one wants to give it up. Everyone wants more, and no one really can definitively say what that means from state to state. So all of us on this call right now who are presenting are laughing, and probably some that we can't see as well, because you know exactly what that means. What that means in a rural state that is very, very vehement about local control is making sure that there's a push and pull with state policy and state leadership that creates a framework for local success. And when we're talking about local control and a state policy framework in this discussion and in this context, I think it means making sure that we have some stability and some consistency from district to district. And that may look different. We, at the state level in Wyoming at least, we do not select statewide curriculum, but we do provide guidance and professional development to ensure that the curriculum that's selected at the local level aligns with the state standards and aligns with our statewide assessment. So I think continuing framework at this level to what happens in the classroom is really important. But when we talk about a blended learning system, it's really, in Wyoming, and sort of accidentally, we have a learning management system. And we use one that is statewide. It's voluntary, but we had almost every school district and every post-secondary institution voluntarily utilizing the learning management system that was set up in our state. And within just a couple of days of school closures, we saw, from maybe 20% of our teachers across the state accessing our learning management system skyrocket to near 100%. I know that learning management system that felt a little esoteric to me as a parent has now become my best friend, and I get about 18 messages a day from them to help guide my son in his blended learning or online learning journey. So I think having that support from the statewide level around a learning management system, that encouragement for broadband support, and maybe some encouragement at the local level with providers and funding for to ensure equitable access by everyone in your state, no matter where they live, is really important. And then I think that in this time of COVID-19, we've also uncovered some brand new equity issues. And they're not equity issues that we necessarily have thought of before. We're seeing some of our really great teachers who are some of our most seasoned teachers who have relied on brick and mortar classrooms to deliver a really great instructional cue or instructional program to students struggle with an online situation. And so it's created some equity issues that have nothing to do with demographics, have nothing to do with the size of the school that students are in, and have nothing to do with the student's ability or challenges or first language or anything like that. So as a state, what we really want to focus on, in addition to that infrastructure and that policy that creates the framework, is really making sure that we build the capacity of our educators and of other equity issues that are cropping up as a result of pivoting to this blended or competency-based or online learning environment that's brand new to all of us, but that, again, we have an opportunity and an obligation to double down on and make sure that that students are the true beneficiaries of this. So again, just to kind of sum up, at the state level, honoring local control and really working with policymakers, including our legislature, our state board, our other colleagues from across the nation, to set a strong framework for education that guides local districts to success in the classroom. Thanks, Julia.
Yeah, thank you so much. And then I'm going to move over to Superintendent Baylor, and I was wondering if you could talk about the really fun stuff, some of the funding difficulties that many schools, rural schools face, and how this really impacts students in a time like this, and what are some of these long-term funding concerns that we should be thinking about?
So I appreciate that very much. That's an excellent question, and I think it does really sum up even what Carissa and Jillian were just talking about. Carissa had mentioned some of the opportunities, the advantages that we have in rural states, being able to mobilize things and turn on a dime a little bit more quickly because we're a smaller state. We've also maybe been ahead of the curve on some of these things because of our sheer isolation or remoteness, we've had to deploy some of the technological answers as our solutions than other states and other communities might not have had to. As Carissa was talking about the special needs and special education directors, we have a common place. It's very common for us to create cooperatives or regional education associations that enter into joint purchasing agreements, those types of things. The other issue that I think we had an advantage of with our students with special needs is that we had to employ telehealth long before others needed to. So as we were transitioning to home education or home-based education, than non-in-person, our OT and our PT and our speech path and all of those therapists and those medical providers or those assistance providers were very used to delivering telehealth through that. Even our paraprofessionals were a little bit more accustomed because sometimes those same students were homebound. And so homebound for us doesn't mean 3 blocks away. Homebound for us means 45 minutes out into the country. And so that's one of the advantages. But then when Jillian talked about local control versus, Carissa's economy of scale, that's where rural school districts really do have the challenge that I think the financials really do come to light. And so in times like this where you try to balance that local control with that economy of scale, even though they're used to it by forming their own cooperatives when it's their choice, it's much different in a time of a pandemic where it's an emergency. I'm needed to reconcile even my own thinking and my own team's thinking about what is our role. Jillian talked about we don't create curriculum and we set standards, and that's the way that it was. But the way that we were able to reconcile this and the way that we're dealing with the CARES Act and maybe some of the purchases or funding that we're talking about right now is the idea that even in natural disasters, whether there's a hurricane or a snowstorm or a fire or a blizzard or whatever it might be, the Red Cross comes in and provides the cots, the blankets, the water for those locales that just simply don't have the opportunity they don't have the capacity within their local government systems in order to gather enough cots, blankets, and water. And so we're envisioning ourselves a little bit like the Red Cross of education at this point. While our local school districts are filled up to their capacity with trying to find our missing students or making sure that those students that aren't engaged, are they just not engaged and they're being a typical teenager, not engaging with homework, or are they in trouble? So that's what our locals are really focusing there and expending their energy in. So at this point, the state needs to step in and I think provide the emergency supplies of cots, blankets, and water, in our terms, diagnostic assessments, types of materials, and a learning journey, precision learning journeys. And so we have provided our CARES funding through the formula, the Title I formula to our local school districts, but between the governor's gear dollars and our SEA reserve funding, we'll do a statewide survey working with our legislative body, to get their input, so it's a collective decision, but we're viewing how do we leverage the small amount of dollars that rural states get to the maximum impact that it can have for the majority of our school districts. And we're just kind of wearing that Red Cross hat right now. So.
Yeah, thank you so much. And then Superintendent Ybarra, I got kind of a two-parter for you. So can you discuss what Idaho has seen in terms of some of this inequity in e-learning in rural regions and how holistically we can address these? And then also, do you see this as an opportunity, for districts to start to collaborate better and consolidate programs between districts, or is this a conversation that the state can really get into right now?
So that is a great question, and I really appreciate Jillian and Kirsten talking about the importance of local control in our state. So we've heard some concerns about maintaining their identity, the schools as we move through this, but also making sure that we have the supports in place to help them during this crisis. And so the model that Idaho is really looking at right now is the opt-in model that Jillian mentioned earlier. So we want to make sure that we're meeting the needs of all students and making sure that whatever learning management system that Idaho chooses to take a look at is an opt-in, and that the district is really able to own that. Again, meeting the needs of students at the local level. We also have cooperatives. We do not, in Idaho, again, I think It's in different levels. You know, you have your state trying to step in right now, and like Kirsten say, kind of be the Red Cross here moving forward. But again, districts are doing the best they can. We're all going to face some challenges moving forward as far as probably cuts with the economy and the closures. But right now we're just trying to help districts level the playing field for students to make sure that we are filling those learning gaps for everybody, not just for students with disabilities, but students also who are English language learners and students of poverty. And so I have great faith in our educators and our school administrators who are looking for ways to address the equity. They're building bonds with their teachers and their principals, and they're continuing to serve them through meals and really innovative ways. We do not choose curriculum for them either. We are just there to show them where the resources are right now. We're having weekly webinars, and each one of my directors will go around and show them where the resources are. Tomorrow we're having one around the importance from national superintendents and some of the solutions that they are using in their states. And so, for example, my content and curriculum director was sharing Khan Academy, and we're having Sal Khan on tomorrow actually to talk about that. So we're really looking at giving options to help best meet the needs of those students. We really need to start looking at connectivity strategically, and the issue of the devices strategically. In Idaho, I will say under a previous initiative, we were able to get all of our high school level students equipped with Wi-Fi, but that doesn't, we have noticed through this pandemic that hasn't translated into the home. And so that's where we're really seeing a little bit of a discrepancy there in providing opportunities for our students. We're also hearing around some back from parents around the lack of the cohesive approach online to the learning. And so, you know, we've had some elementary students doing packets while and picking those up and returning those, and there's some concern around the safety of that. And then there are some students who have, like I said, the learning management system option. So we want to make sure that we are helping districts fill the gap, but maintaining that local control. We do have collaboratives as well. I think that with our, we have a rural schools collaborative within my department. We have a special education collaborative that is a cost savings to a lot of our districts moving forward that can help fill in some of those gaps. But it's created a lot of stress for our families here, for our students and our parents, and not to mention our teachers. So we also need to be providing social emotional support as well. So I can't emphasize enough for the state of Idaho how this opt-in model moving forward for a learning management system is really how we are going to have a systematic way of communicating with everybody about all these great resources that we have to offer to them.
Thank you so much. Excuse me. And we have time for just a couple more questions, and I would like to try to get to all of them, so we're going to move through them pretty quickly. This one I'm going to direct towards Superintendent Baylor, since you were talking about the importance of healthcare earlier. Can you talk a little bit about the Access to Cares funding for school nurses and health systems within the schools for PPE, and you know, some of the potential funding mechanisms that you see for really supporting the healthcare aspect of schools as students return in the fall?
Thanks, Julia. I saw that in the question list, and I was hoping that that would come up. I think that's really important, and unfortunately, right now, I think we're still continuing to view it as sort of a bifurcated conversation in education, and say we need the health officials, we need the state epidemiologists and the county health officials to make determinations about how to keep schools safe and how to keep students safe during this pandemic. And I think that's really a safe approach, because we haven't traditionally partnered. It's not that we haven't partnered well, but the protocols have been in place, and We've leaned on each other where we needed to, but we haven't truly partnered in this way yet. And that makes me nervous. We don't say, well, we have the social emotional needs to address with students, but that's not really our bailiwick in education. That's providers' bailiwick in the community. And yet that's how we're sort of approaching health and safety as it relates to the pandemic in our schools. I'm not sure that's the right thing to do. We can't say as educators we're ready to make those decisions, but I do think that we need to have more than a bifurcated approach and more than an approach that says we're going to rely on the healthcare industry, on our school nurses and on our county health officials to make those determinations, and we'll follow along. I think that there needs to be more of a partnership and less of a bifurcation in that conversation. And I'm not sure what it looks like. There are a host of funding opportunities, but right now I'm not sure that we're far enough along to know what's going to be the most helpful. Is it on one end of the spectrum building more classrooms or leveraging space across our community? Or on the other end of the spectrum, is it instituting more hand washing stations in a school, or masks for students or thermometers? I don't know that we're far enough along in the pandemic to know exactly what the best precautions are, and we ought to be circling our wagons together right now to have those discussions so that when those decisions are made, we're making them together instead of counting on each other to make the decisions and the others follow. Thanks again.
Can I jump in on the funding aspect just from a high level about CARES? So if we think about this original CARES package that went out, it was meant for relief, right? It happened right away when all of this came into play. And when we start to do the distribution, which states are doing right now, the amounts will cover many of the expenses that have happened up to date. There will be an opportunity to pay for a number of things to help going forward, but it's part of the reason that there's a real need for like the what comes next. And so this is the next supplemental that we really believe is an important part of what's needs to come next. So it's all the things Jillian mentioned, like if you're going to put in additional hand washing stations, that costs. And we would hope that it would be as flexible as this current supplemental package, which is very flexible, but it's got to be determined at the local level to like what's going to be the most useful for that. So I just want to caution against this being like a big windfall. It really is relief for costs that have already been incurred, and that there is a need for the next supplemental as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for pointing that out. That's really helpful. And I think we'll just close with one final wrap-up question that will be for Superintendent Ybarra and Superintendent Baylor. Can you just touch briefly, maybe like 1 minute, on what's one way that you see the structure of your schools changing upon reopening? You know, I think we're hearing from everyone, you know, our schools are never gonna look the same. What do you see that looking like? And we'll start with Superintendent Ybarra and then move to Superintendent Baylor.
Again, that's a great question, and it kind of leads back to what we were talking about in the very beginning. This is an opportunity in the face of adversity to really go into a blended model, I think, of meeting all the kids' needs across our state. You know, we have been working on mastery-based education in the state of Idaho, and trying to personalize learning for our students. And I think when our doors reopen, we'll definitely be looking at connectivity, blended learning, how we use a variety of approaches to so that we're reaching all the needs of our kids, you know, and possibly what is, if we are to face another closure, it'll look totally different than it did this time. You know, I go back to the largest school district that we have in our state closed in a weekend, and then pretty much every school after that followed. So we didn't have really an opportunity to even think about it. But I think now we have an opportunity to really do great things for kids. And I really think and know wholeheartedly the way the staff is and the teachers are stepping up to distribute free meals and provide day camps for our medical personnel and our first responders, the way that they are working harder under these conditions, that they understand this is a great opportunity moving forward to move to a real blended model for our students and reach all their needs. And again, like Jillian said earlier, we've been having conversations as chiefs around the social emotional learning aspect of our students, but I think now it's really being highlighted, and how can we reach those needs? How can we communicate with parents right now? And so I think all of that is an opportunity to change the system that folks talk about sometimes in a negative light moving forward. So I think it's a great opportunity to see a huge change in the way that we do business for our kids, especially in the state of Idaho, and how we can reach those rural and remote students moving forward.
So 3 things that I think North Dakota will never be the same, 3 areas: family engagement, our true understanding of what personalized learning really means, and grading systems, and in our world, assessment, how we measure what we value. So 3 things. The first, I'll dig a little deeper in family engagement. We had begun that journey, but I don't know that we've seen a stronger demonstration in my 30+ career in education of how authentically the partnerships have occurred. Each side knows that families know that they simply cannot have their children achieve all that they want them to achieve without the educators' partnership, and our educators have a truer and better understanding of how authentic that partnership from school to home must be. That will never be the same. If we do it well, it should never be the same. We should make sure that we leverage that. The second is personalized learning. We've all been working towards that. I think there was an absolute myth, a misnomer, that personalized learning meant distance learning. And I'm sure that I'm not alone with my colleagues, is that we have had some students that are absolutely flourishing with the technology of distance learning, and others that are really struggling. But what has come out of that is it needed to be personalized. When you're in a non-person and not a place-based environment, you understand how important personalized learning is. And if you're going to talk about individual personalized learning, you must talk about valuing a different way of measuring.